What's out there? What creates the shadows in the corners or the creatures of the dark? Who are those on the other side? What do they have to say? This is the Gateway Podcast. This is not your normal style of paranormal talk radio. Brought to you live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM New Orleans.
And welcome again to this episode of the Gateway Podcast. I'm your host, C.L. Thomas, from somewhere in the Mojave Desert. Today's weather in Las Vegas, it's quite cold and it's very windy. I think we have like 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts out there right now. Pretty incredible. They call it the Santa Ana winds. They're a little early. They usually start in early December, but for some reason it's a little later. So it's kind of unusual. We're not experiencing any rain or anything like that. And I know I always give you guys the down low on Las Vegas weather. That's what it's doing. We're having a huge dust storm outside. It's we're getting gusts around 80 miles an hour, and it's pretty interesting out there. So if you notice, I'm wearing a hat. It's a long story, you guys. I had surgery this week on this arm, so I can't really move it. It's in a brace. I had some screws put in my bicep here to reattach a bicep, and I had some other tears and things in there as well. Originally they went in for a tendon tear, which is what they thought it was, but once they got in there they found a whole lot of other stuff, like a bicep was torn and things like that. So I just have to say, for those sports people out there, you know, I used to think that I was pretty strong. I'm a marathon runner. I love doing all of that sports stuff, and I've had this injury for quite some time. And I always thought, okay, football players were not really good sportsmen because all they do is they stand on the field and they look pretty, right? They don't really do anything. They wear their tights. There's a lot of, every time something little happens, they all have to stop and discuss it for an hour, and it just drags on and on and on. And so I always assumed the hockey players are the real sports people here. They're the ones that know how to skate. It's fast. You know, if there's an issue, they duke it out right there on the site, and it's over with, and they get on with the game, right? And football players are out there being pretty much pansies. Well, this kind of gave me a whole new appreciation of football players, because when I went in to see the surgeon, he initially told me that this is something that usually a football player, what he sees in football players, he usually treats the Raiders and things like that around town here. And that's what he said. And so he asked me, what was it that I was doing to cause such an injury? I have no idea. But nonetheless, same thing. I have a new appreciation because it sure did hurt. Well, my guest tonight, let's get started here. My guest tonight, I wanted to have her on because she wrote this wonderful book. It's called Six Women of Salem. And I just got done reading this. And what she does as well, I'll get her on here to talk about what she does with this book. But I wanted to have her on because so often in the paranormal community, particularly in the witch community, anyone that practices witchcraft probably heard this. There's a lot of people out there that will say stuff like, well, they were a witch because they have a relative that was involved in the Salem Witch Trials, or their ancestor, it's usually always Bridget. Their ancestor is Bridget, one of the women who, she owned a saloon. We'll get into all this. But the current state of affairs is everyone thinks that these women were actual witches, and they're kind of not. So my guest tonight is going to talk about some of the women that were involved in the witch trials and what the circumstances really are. And she's going to address some of the things that are not true, that are circulating over and over again. So without further ado, Marilynne Roach, she's a writer, she's a researcher, she's an illustrator, and she's also a lecturer. She's written 9 books. Most of them are very heavily, which is why I really love her. She's really done the work and the research behind everything that goes into her books. So without further ado, let me get her on. Marilynne, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for the invitation.
So I'm really excited. You look so bundled up. You're in Boston,
yeah,
right?
near Boston. We have a wind chill, but it's not 80 miles an hour. So you win on that one.
It's some kind of desert thing. It doesn't happen very often, and it's not a steady 80-mile-an-hour wind. It's like the steady winds are around 25, but then the gusts that come through are anywhere from 60 to 80 miles an hour. So it's like blowing my whole yard down and everything. It's crazy.
Knock you over type wind.
But it's not cold like it is where you are.
It's cold, and it's into the single digits with the wind chill in first thing in the morning, at least.
Well, Marilynne, you wrote this fabulous book, and what I really like about this book is you take 6 characters in this book, all of them from different backgrounds. So you have the older woman who is kind of declining in her wealth, which is a misconception on my part because I always figured that these were all nothing more than land disputes when you start discussing the Salem Witch Trials. Then you had Mary Warren, and then you have Rebecca Nurse. You had Mary English. I think that was the businesswoman, right, who owned property.
Oh, yeah.
Then you had the Spitfire Bridget.
Yeah.
And then you had Tituba, who had no power at all. So,
right.
First of all, to get started, how did you get into this researching the Salem Witch Trials?
Well, it was always a topic of interest. There were perhaps 2 books about it in my public library when I was growing up and first getting interested in this. But it took off, the interest, back in during the bicentennial of the Revolution, when all local history was getting a new lease on life. And I took the commuter rail train to Salem from where I live, just outside of Boston, and to see certain things that I wanted to see, and found out that some of the stories weren't exactly what I had read about. The presentations have some of the presentations have really improved since then because other people were getting interested in the witch trials, and a lot of scholarly research was about to be done. But while I was up there that first day, beautiful day, it's like the city was drawing me in to get interested. And I thought I'd had some books published already, and I thought this would be an interesting subject. Why don't I write another book about the witch trial? And it took 27 years to do that.
Wow.
Yeah, right. I was so deep into it that I would have wasted 27 years of my life if I just dropped it. But that was the first book on the Day-by-Day Chronicle of the trials, which turned out okay. It got published and it was well received. It's still in print, I'm happy, relieved to say. But then, what am I going to do next? And I'm not sure where the idea came from, but doing a biographical view of specific individuals, people who have information that's available, seemed like a good idea. So I chose 6 women and focused on them. And as you said, they came from different walks of life, so it gave a broader picture of what had happened, I hope. And yeah, I believe my agent, by then I had an agent, suggested that maybe each section or chapter could have a fictional introduction, identified as fiction. I'm not trying everything. I have footnotes and stuff about everything in it, and where I try to get inside the minds of the people who are acting through this tragedy, and introduce them that way, what I think is in their minds. But yes, footnote end notes are in the back. And I try to back up everything, including the fictionalized parts. But it was interesting working with the different individuals because they had such different lives. And you mentioned Bridget Bishop. She was not the same person who had the tavern. There are
Oh, she
two. Yeah, this was figured out by some genealogists a while back.
so it's another misconception.
Well,
Yeah.
there are two good wife bishops, both of them married to men named Edward Bishop, who apparently aren't related to each other very closely, but there's where the confusion was. And the court papers for both of them got filed together very early on, so that when historians looked at it, they thought it was the same person, which makes sense. But
Oh, yeah.
you check out with who the neighbors are who are complaining and any geographic references in the accounts. These are two different people in adjoining towns. So Sarah Bishop and her husband, Edward, ran an unlicensed tavern that the neighbors were always complaining about on the Salem Village Beverly border. And Bridget Bishop lived down near Salem Harbor and she had been widowed twice and was married to her third husband at this point. But she
Which
was
in itself,
pardon me?
that would have given her a really bad name. Anyway.
Oh, well, she was assertive, certainly, and stuck up for her rights. And her second husband, who hadn't been as nice to her as the third one, seemed to be fairly ordinary. But the second one, and she got into fights where each of them ended up with probably black eyes, but certain bruises were mentioned in the court cases. And she had to stand on the in public and apologize for this, be on display. Her husband, who had hit her, she hit him back, didn't have to because his daughter by a previous marriage paid the fine for him, but not for the stepmother. So people knew that she had been in trouble, which I think was apparently justified. But anyway, she was an interesting character, but she didn't run the tavern.
Gotcha. So it is a big misconception for some reason.
Yeah,
Everyone seems to think or portrays her as, and it's interesting because the paranormal community, they always pick her as their ancestor of why they are into witchcraft as well, or why they have the sixth sense, I should say, like why they possess special mediumship skills, that sort of thing. They always seem to trace it back to Bridget, and I think it's because her name is one of the ones that's thrown out there out of all the women that was involved in the witch trials. It's always Bridget or Rebecca. Rebecca's in the other one, Rebecca Nurse.
Rebecca and her sister Mary Esty have a lot of known descendants who can trace back generation by generation.
Got it. So that must be where that comes
from. Bridget had one child who lived, and she had children, or a child, and there were descendants, but I don't know how far down you can trace them. But all of the people who were accused, and certainly the ones who were executed, all of them said that they were not witches, and they meant in any sense, that they were good Christians. There were petitions for some of them saying, this is a good woman, she's a good Christian woman, which backed up what they were trying to say in court, that they were not trying to commune with the devil, which is not what modern Wiccans do. But I would say that none of them were witches by any definition, not as another religion, not as neo-pagans, Wiccans, and certainly not fairy tale characters. And as amusing as Bewitched was, they're not magical characters as in the TV show. They're more humans who suffered from it. Even though there's a bronze statue of Samantha Stevens in the middle of Salem that was donated by the TV station. TV.
Right. I have my picture with that statue.
A lot of people have pictures of themselves with it.
It's really funny. But, can you kind of set the stage a little bit? How did this happen? And why do we still think that 300 years later that these people were actual witches? How did that stigma carry on for so many years like
Yeah.
this.
Well, maybe because it's more interesting than some theories. But I mean, the whole town lost its calm around 1692 because there was so many stresses, regular, real life material stresses at the same time, because Massachusetts had lost its charter from England, so while they waited to see what England was going to do about that, they didn't know what rights they would have and how much self-government, because there had been a period where a royal governor was sent over who really had the only say, and wasn't sympathetic to the locals, that you could have one town meeting a year, and that was just uh, to elect somebody to catch the stray pigs and local stuff and purely local matters. And that was it. You weren't supposed to be gathering and making decisions. That was for the governor to take. And even the legislature had fewer rights at that time. So he's overthrown when England has its own revolution and the regime change where one king is kicked out and somebody else comes in. And at that point, Massachusetts is waiting to see what's going to happen under the new regime. How many rights will we have? This increased Mather, who had been in England trying to negotiate a charter with the former king, has finally convinced England to allow Massachusetts a charter, although they don't have entire self-government. They have to.
And this was
Yeah, that gets involved.
He was the pastor of the First Church, right?
In Boston, yes. He's the father of Cotton Mather, who's 29 years old at the time. And taking over the work while his father's away. Increase and a new governor who actually was born in Maine, so at least they get a New Englander, come back in May and find, with the charter, and find out that the prisons in 3 counties are crowded with suspects. But back at the beginning of it all, which the end of January, is when the girls at the parsonage start acting oddly and experiencing pains and reporting pricking sensations and headaches and just acting oddly. But at the same time, because of the political situation, there's also war with French Canada, the French settlement. King Louis would like to take over the rest of the Eastern Seaboard, and their indigenous allies, who have their own reason to resent colonial settlements moving into more of their territory in the Maine, New Hampshire area. So there's that. There's pirates out on the ocean. There's French privateers preying on English and New English ships and fishing boats. And the New England privateers prey on the French boats too, if they can. And the economy is not good because of the maritime losses and because of the expense of the frontier wars. So there's all that going on. There's been some smallpox that's got everybody on edge. It wasn't a big epidemic at this point, but you didn't know if another one was going to come along. And
well,
then
the population wasn't that great yet. The population was relatively small still.
Oh, by our standards, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
But at the end of January, there's a French and Indian forces attack York, Maine, which is in South Maine, and it's closer to Massachusetts, to Salem, and so forth. And that, I think, was really a big scare at the time because people were taken captive. There were a lot of deaths, and that part of what they were worrying about is getting closer and closer. So it's around the time that the girls start acting oddly, and it takes them over a month before the parents of some of them and neighbors go to the law to swear out a complaint against certain people in the neighborhood. One of them is Tituba, who's in the same household as the girl, as of two of the girls. The Sarah Osborne, who's a sickly woman who's had let's see, her second husband isn't letting go of the first husband's property to her sons, and there's problems there. And also, and Sarah Good, who's a beggar, in effect, which she is not happy about because she came from a relatively well-off family to begin with. But her unfortunate marriages had left her with her dead husband's debts, and her second husband, William Good, isn't great as a breadwinner. So, she's crabby, and that doesn't help when you're trying to get on with your neighbors. She has a right to be upset, of course. Is another forceful woman. So they're questioned on the 1st of March. It's a hearing where the Salem magistrates are seeing if there's any reason to have an actual trial, to save somebody for trial. And of course, they can't really try anyone on a capital charge until they get the new charter. So it ends with Tituba confessing. She's saying, the witches were against me too. They tried to hurt me. They said if I didn't join them, they would hurt me more. They'd hurt the girls. But I resisted them. But the questions keep coming because they were harder questions on her since she's enslaved and has nobody to speak for her. And she's saying she's a victim of the witches. She's spinning a story, I think, of what she thinks the judges, the magistrates will believe, because they keep saying, now tell the truth, when she said she wasn't a witch and when she hadn't worked any evil magic. But she says that there are others out there. I don't know who they are, but there's more of them. And for a couple of weeks, everybody in the village and surrounding communities is thinking, well, who else is out there? And I imagine that people are thinking of possible suspects, of neighbors that they never really liked. So one of the first after that who are named includes Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, because they seem to be okay, perfectly nice people. And Rebecca Nurse has a big supportive family of children, and her husband's alive, so she got people to speak for her. But she's arrested. Sarah Good's little girl, Dorothy, who's 4 years old, or 5 maybe, is arrested because she's presumably following in her mother's footsteps. And things keep escalating. Excuse me?
They arrested a 4-year-old.
Yes, unless she was 5. Because, and this is the thing that they should have known couldn't be trusted from the beginning, because her spirit had been seen by her supposed victims, the bewitched girls, and 4 at the beginning, and then there's more people who think they're bewitched. They're having convulsions and so forth. And maybe at the beginning they believed this, but convinced themselves. But if somebody's specter, which is like a ghost, only the people are still alive, supposedly the witch in question could step out of her body, or his body, because there were men accused too, and invisibly work harm on their subjects. And the people who are supposedly bewitched can see this coming at them, but nobody else can. No kidding. Nobody else could see this, but it seemed real at the time. And it should not have been accepted as evidence, because at the end of it, when people were starting to calm down, the point made was that you can't trust the source of the vision, because it's the sort of thing where the devil is providing the specter, who's probably a devil in disguise rather than the actual person. So you can't trust the information, and you can't prove it in court that this person who's being presented as a specter is really a witch. But whatever the effect in court was, convinced the magistrates that, yeah, that's very suspicious, but we have other reason to believe that this person is a witch. And from the testimony, it would seem that the other information, evidence, they thought, would be accounts by neighbors of what would be coincidences, like I had an argument with her and then the cow died, that sort of thing. Or people got sick after an argument. Maybe they scared themselves into it, maybe it just coincided with an illness. So 20 people suffered from that, suffered the execution from that. Actually, 19. One man died under torture, is what it was, which they never did again. But yeah, 20 people lost their lives from it, plus people who died in jail because of, well, they're not clean, they're not modern facilities, and some people died of disease. So that began to escalate over the summer, and once the charter came back, a temporary court of oyer and terminer, which means to hear and to determine, which is a temporary court, was instituted to try all of the cases that would otherwise not have been tried until they reorganized the government enough, according to British command, to establish regular courts. So there were 9 judges appointed. One of them leaves after Bridget Bishop's trial, and when she's found guilty, because he disagrees with the way things are going. You can't trust actual evidence, which had been said by several of the ministers at the beginning, but the people who were making the decisions thought, well, there's more to it than just spectral evidence, which there wasn't. But so there's 8 judges. A quorum of 5 had to sit for any one session, because there were 4 sessions throughout the summer, meeting in Salem, because that's where all the witnesses, most of the witnesses were. I mean, not just Salem, it's surrounding towns too. But ordinarily before this, all capital cases would have been tried in Boston, the capital. But there were just so many people north of that it was easier to move the judges than to move the population down to Boston to testify.
So, Marilynne, the
So, let's see. I estimated that about 190 people were suspected at least, but not necessarily brought to court. There were all told 52 trials, most of them after the panic died down, and 30 people found guilty. Everybody who was found guilty, and 19 people were hanged.
Hey, Marilynne.
Plus the one man who died under torture.
Marilynne.
By the end of the summer, by September, more people were beginning to react against what was going on. And
hey, Marilynne, can you hear me? Hello?
Information from England is how to proceed, because everything that they were doing, somebody else would be accused. It just escalated too much, and it was more than they could handle. So the governor, Phipps, put a pause on it at the end of October, which is now the busy month in Salem tourism, but it had calmed down enough. However, people were in jail, and they're not heated all that well. There were fireplaces, but it just was an unhealthy urge situation once it got really cold winter. So
Hey, Marilyn.
they had not heard from England. They wouldn't hear until next July, as a matter of fact. So just to proceed anyway, they had to establish Superior Court, same Superior Court we have now, different cast of characters, to oversee the rest of the cases, beginning in January in Salem, in what is now 1693. The date then was still 1692 because the year began in March.
Marilyn.
And there were most of the trials, 30 or so, in January. Most of the cases were dismissed for lack of evidence, which actually they all should have been, but and only, and I put that in air quotes, only 3 were found guilty. But a stay was put on the execution until they could hear from England. So nobody was actually hanged after that. And eventually, when England sent them advice, which amounts to do your best, do what you think is best, people were let out of jail when they could pay the fees, because you had to pay your room and board.
Marilyn.
And it slowly ended. And one of the last cases, in May of 1693, was Tituba's, and she was found not guilty.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So I was trying to back you up a little bit because I wanted to talk about the conditions that these people were experiencing in the jail from the accounts that I've read. And I wanted to talk about the judges and who they were. Like they had Nathaniel Hawthorne's great grandfather was actually one of these judges, and he actually changes his last name because he doesn't want to be associated with that at all. But these judges were there were 2 religious leaders, from my understanding, Increase Mather and
No, there were no ministers on the. Actually, ministers who are working ministers who have a congregation did not take any civil roles.
okay.
They were barred from it.
So what was the conditions like in the jail? Because from the accounts I've read, it was that once you were arrested, like if you were arrested and accused as a witch back then, the jailers, if you didn't have the money to pay for your room and board in this jail cell and you didn't have relatives to bring you that stuff, legally they were able to confiscate whatever property you had.
No, I'm happy to say they didn't do that. No, property was never taken, not by an accuser, not for an accuser or anybody. There are existing documents where the jailer was asking for reimbursement and back pay. He had 2 years of back pay that hadn't been paid. And the itemization mentions how much he had expended for certain prisoners, which was handy to know. But you at least got bread and water or something on that line. But you also, if you survived this, you were supposed to pay room and board, and a relative would have to come up with that because you're in jail. What can you do for money?
Wow.
There was one woman who was tried near the end in February, actually, of 93, who was found not guilty, although it seemed suspicious at the time. She was found not guilty, and she died a few weeks later because her family wasn't able to find the money to pay her room and board. But yeah.
So she just starved to death?
No, I guess she had bread and water, but she was old and ill from being in an unsanitary place for months.
Yeah, that's really
because
sad.
there's no plumbing.
So
But
Out of these 6 women that you have written about, the only one that could conceivably even have any kind of witchcraft abilities at all, if they did have any, would have been Tituba. And it's because of the story that stems from her reading the tea leaves or something to the kids
Uh,
that sets this whole thing
yeah,
off.
that seems to be something from the 19th century, assuming that because she was from presumably Barbados, but somewhere other than New England, and not white, that she had these strange customs, if not abilities. Uh, there's really nothing in the contemporary record. She admits to having worked a witch cake charm, but that was in English or European at least um, anti-witchcraft method of finding out who is supposedly casting the evil magic at the victim. But it was told to her by a helpful neighbor who explained how you do it, mixing the cheap flour and feeding it to the dog after you cook it. But that was a European method, and that's the only thing she is definitely associated with. She might have told the children stories from wherever she came from, which could have been Barbados, and prior to that, maybe Central America. But those are guesses. Nothing in the court records say for certain.
Got it.
There were some poppets, which is like a voodoo doll, poppets found in the basement foundation of a house that Bridget Bishop had lived in that was being dismantled for a new house on her property. But that house had been built well before Bridget lived in it, when she was married to her second husband. And I think it was probably one of those luck charms to ward off evil magic that were worked into houses structure and were for a long time afterwards. But I think that had to have been put there before she even lived in it. So
Right.
there's mention of poppets, but sometimes it sounds like any bundle of fabric remnants that someone had around when people start confessing out of fear. They want to see a poppet. We'll show you a poppet. Here's these rags, and I've tied a string around them. So nobody seems to be really working magic, but people were frightened enough to confess to things after a while.
Can we talk a little bit about the setting in Salem that kind of led up to all of this? So this is late 1600s. There's no electricity. It's a very cold winter. We're in the winter months of January.
Mhm.
They wouldn't have celebrated. I don't think the Puritans celebrated Christmas. Correct me
They
if
did
I'm wrong.
not. No, they
Yeah.
didn't.
So it would have been like a dark time for them.
Yes, and with the attack on York on the frontier, that was frightening.
Right.
There were also, local controversies and quarrels at the same time that were more local than just the general unease in Massachusetts. Part of Salem Village, where it started, is the rural part of a larger Salem, larger than Salem is now. It comprised most of what is now Danvers and parts of Middleton. But they're off at the edge of things. It's a less rockier soil or something. It's not as prosperous as downtown Salem. And part of Salem Village would like to be its own town because going into Salem for anything they needed to do for town business, standing watch or selectmen meetings, it was a long walk. And there was a day when I was up there, and the bus didn't come, and I walked from Danvers into downtown Salem to get the train, and it is a long walk, and there are more distant parts of Salem Village. So that was one concern, but others didn't want to break off to be a separate town because there were the economy. Their economy was more associated with the harbor part, with the other where merchants were. So there's that controversy, and because after wearing out the patience of 3 other ministers, they had in fact hired Samuel Parris, who to be their permanent minister. He's ordained. He's supposed to stay the rest of his life in harmony with his congregation, but it doesn't work out that way. It must have been personality conflicts, but after he's been there a while, some good part of the congregation would rather he was somewhere else. They would rather have another minister. They're sorry they hired him. Other people are supporting him during and after the trials, but there's a controversy about whether he's a good idea to be there or not. So those who don't like him just stop paying their share of his salary. And it's cold, and the wood pile is down to almost nothing. So that was another stress that particular winter. And there's also neighborhood quarrels from some of the accusations. You can tell that Mrs. Ann Putnam really didn't like Rebecca Nurse or Martha Corey because she says she sees their specters coming after her. So there must have been some pre-existing quarrel there that we don't have a record of. But gossip, people rubbed each other the wrong way. They were supposed to be living in harmony as good Christians, but human nature is stronger than that.
It's a shame.
But the part that didn't get written down because we have a lot of documents that have survived, but not everything, and not every personal collision was recorded anyway, unless they sued each other for something. There might be a record of it, but we don't know. But gossip was a favorite indoor sport, and there was a lot of that.
It wasn't naturally because there's no television or anything.
No. Yes,
so
people talked.
Can you, real quick, can you talk just briefly about the 6 women that you mentioned in your book, and your thoughts about why they might have been targeted?
Well, Rebecca Nurse wasn't the usual suspect because her husband's alive. She has a large extant family where they're supporting her, and they supported her all through it. Because even after she was found guilty, they got petitions together and they got neighbors to speak for her, and it didn't help in the end. But she's not the usual suspect. But again, the Putnams, for some reason, didn't like her already. Let's see, the next one, Bridget Bishop. Well, she was much more assertive than a lot of women, and had quarreled publicly with bloody noses, maybe, with her second husband. So she had been accused also once when she was between husbands and widow. She was accused of theft, but the one piece of evidence from that problem, the opponent says that she stole eggs by means of magic. So maybe she never stole anything, but there was a certain amount of suspicion about her. Mary English was the richest woman in Salem. She had property of her own that she'd inherited from her mother, who was quite a businesswoman. She's married to Philip English, the richest man in Salem, who is from the Isle of Jersey, which is a British, as now, the Channel Islands, I think they're protectorates of England. the government isn't the same as downtown London, but they're part of England, but with their own different laws. And because it's closer to France than to England, the native language then was French. So he's French speaking, and that's kind of unnerving if you think you're going to be attacked by French people out of Canada at any moment. And she was assertive, so there is that. Let's see. Well, Mrs. Ann Putnam, who seemed to be a tightly wound character. She didn't like certain neighbors already, it's hard to say, but she had been disappointed in inheritance when her father died. She didn't get much of anything, and it all went to her mother, who's an assertive woman actually, and her brother, a couple of brothers who were running a family business of they ran a ferry over the Merrimack River. So they wanted to keep the business rather than divide it up amongst the children. So that was a disappointment. It might have had something to do with it. There's Tituba, who is a woman of color, always described as Indian, by the way, by the white men who are writing the stories. She's from somewhere other than New England, possibly Barbados, where Samuel Parris, who owns her, had inherited a plantation, sugar, which he rented out. But there'd been a slave revolt, and there'd been a hurricane, and he changed his career, moved to Massachusetts to become a minister after not either he's a failed merchant, or maybe it was something he always wanted to do, because he'd been to Harvard, but he'd had to leave it when his father died and so forth. So she's in a place where she didn't grow up. She's probably considered an exotic character. And and being enslaved, she doesn't have a lot of people standing in her corner saying, no, she's a good person. She's in an awful situation, but she does survive the trials. And the last one was Mary Warren, who's around 20 or just 18 to 20, who's a hired girl for the Proctor family. John and Elizabeth were the main characters in the crucible. She thinks she's bewitched, or acts that way. I think she convinced herself of it. But then she realized, after John had hit her a few times, actually, to bring her back to her senses, as he thought, that she had been mistaken, that she wasn't really being attacked by witches. She said, and she publicly says this, which unnerved the other supposedly bewitched girls and young women at this point, because more and more people think they're bewitched, because that puts doubt on how accurate their accusations are. So whether it's conscious or unconscious or subliminal or something, they accuse her, Mary Warren, of selling out, because one of the things the specters supposedly did was to urge their victims to join them in the devil's army, and or they would hurt them, which supposedly explains the convulsions. So if she's not feeling those pains anymore, does that mean she's sold out to the devil? Does it mean she is now a witch? And she's arrested and questioned at her hearing, and she is out of her mind with fear. I think she can't put words together for a full sentence, and they have to send her out to calm down, and they then question someone else. I think it was Bridget Bishop on that day. And they bring her back, and she's not making a whole lot of sense, but it sounds like it could be a confession. But after that, she just agreed with whatever they asked her. Are you a witch? Is so and so one of your Confederates? Yeah, whatever. She'll accuse anybody.
Mhm.
And she survives the trials, but kind of disappears into history. Sad
Do
story.
any of these women have anything in common with each other? Other than that they were accused, like, was there anything about them that kind of made them a target? Because they
Well,
all
some
seem so
seem
different.
more obviously suspect, more obvious to be a suspect than others, but they don't seem to have that much interaction with each other. I mean, they live in different places and different uh, situations. Just, I would say they're all women, of course,
Mhm.
but that's not the only reason people would be suspected, because men were arrested too, and 5 of them were put to death. Uh, so quarter of the quarter of the hangings that summer were men, which is the subject of the book I'm writing on now. But no, it's hard to see any connection really, except that they probably had some differences with neighbors who were willing to suspect them. But I don't see too much interaction amongst the 6.
Yeah. Do you think that anything like this could happen again?
Well, it would be in a different guise, not witch suspects. So I would hope not witch suspects, but people can and have been suspected of other things. Uh, let's see. Well, it's often compared to the Army McCarthy hearings of who's a communist and who wasn't in
Oh,
1960,
yeah.
and
Yep.
that that tragedy didn't result in death, I think, but it certainly ruined careers. And it
Mhm.
inspired Arthur Miller to write The Crucible and put that on the map. And that's the source that much of which is quite fictional, actually. But that put the witch trials in front of the public, and it's still there because it's taught in schools and frequently performed. Uh, of course, the part about telling the truth and not being believed, and then lying because people expect you to, and then being believed, it seems to be at the heart of the play, and that was true certainly in 1692.
Wow. Well, Marilynne, we are at the bottom of the hour already. I told you it would go really fast.
It did.
I need a 2-hour show to get into all the stuff I want to discuss, because there was a lot that I wanted to get into and just didn't get a chance to.
Uh,
Where can people find your book? I know I bought my copy, and I have another book of yours too, by the way. I know you got 9 books. I have another one. I got
well,
this
some of
copy at Barnes and Noble.
yeah, Amazon too, and sometimes local bookstores. And if you're in Salem, it's on the shelves.
It's on the shelf just about everywhere, I think.
Well, in Salem at least. It's what 11 or 12 years it's been out, so it's not a new book.
Yeah, it's
But
not new. It's just interesting, though. I just wanted to get you on here and talk a little bit about, because I just hear so often that people in the paranormal community, so often I hear about, oh, I practice witchcraft because, and I'm related to such and such that was also one of the accused witches, and they think that they got their powers from these people, and it's just such a big misconception out there,
yeah,
you know. So I wanted a historian to come on and talk about why that's really not the case.
no, it isn't. But
So
it's a fascinating subject, and it's little nuggets of information keep turning up.
yeah. Oh, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Do you have a website or anything that people can look you up?
Yeah, it needs to be updated. But MarilynneKRoach.com. If you spell Marilyn and Roach correctly, because they're both a little different.
Yeah, but you know what? If you just put Six Women of Salem, put that into Google, and you come right up in there.
I should.
So
Put
that's
in
how
witch and I come right up.
that's how I found your contact information.
Good.
Well, thank you so much. When you come out with your next book, I'll definitely have you back on because it sounds like
Okay.
it's along the same topic lines and things. And I would love to have you come back and just discuss more about Salem.
Thank you. Well, have 6 Men of Salem, they had quite different lives, and it extended over a wider geographic area.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Once you really start digging, I'm just so fascinated by that area. I used to live in that area for a very short time in my life, and I did a dissertation on Nathaniel Hawthorne, his love for maritime. So I did a lot of research on him back in the day, back when I was in school, and dug into. That's how I knew about his grandfather and all the different connections, and just a lot of stuff that I researched within Salem back in my early days. So it's a topic I love.
Good.
But anyway, thank you again for having me for being on the show, and I'll definitely have you back on.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
So there you guys are. It's Marilynne Roach, and she wrote Six Women of Salem. I highly recommend this book for many different reasons, especially if you're really into witchcraft, if you're really into the history of Salem at all. This is a great book to pick up and to read. Again, it's at Barnes & Noble. That's where I picked up this copy. But if you look up MarilynneRoach.com, she does have a website. She's very gracious. She has 9 other books out there that are just as good. Highly recommend. Thank you for listening to The Gateway tonight, broadcast live from 107.7 FM New Orleans, United Public Radio Network, and I will see you again next week. Next week's guest, I have a really good tarot card reader coming on. I'm not going to disclose her name because I don't have it set in stone just yet, but she is planning on coming on. She's pretty famous for tarot card reading, so maybe she'll even do a few readings. I don't know. We'll have to stay tuned till next week. In the meantime, I do have some exciting news about the magazine coming out, and you'll hear more wind about that next week. And that's all I've got for you guys. Until next time.